it's for the purpose of power, or whether it's for, in some cases, legitimate purposes. But we have to think for ourselves, what if we start weaving this fabric in a slightly different way? What if we start changing that dynamic mechanism that we face in the status quo today, which means when you pick up your phone and you make a call to your mother, your sister, your husband, your wife, that call is transiting that global network electronically naked. Anybody can look at it, anybody can listen to it, anybody can read it. What if we change that so that it's protected by default? Every communication, every transaction you engage with is protected. And you don't have to take some activity. You don't have to teach a journalist how to use this sophisticated encryption program, even if it is 20 years old, and you hope that people should be able to get to use it at this point. Instead, we made this fabric work not just for Americans, not just for people in the Netherlands, but for the whole world. If suddenly we could not just support the human rights of people in Germany, France, Brazil, Iran, Russia, China, and America, we could enforce them. We could guarantee them through our technology. And I think this election reminds us that that capability is within our reach today. And we have not just the right to try, but the duty.
I've devoted my career to trying to create that capability. End-to-end secure telephony is what I've been focused on in the last 12 years or so. I had the impression that you might have used something that I made for that too. We went through a lot of trouble to wipe out our email encryption service on the same day that LavaBit did, for what we thought was probably for the same reason. I hope that was I hope that helped.
Edward Snowden, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Have we lost?
Yeah. No,
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ralph Zimmerman.
Thank you so much for everything you do.
I think we like to see Edward Snowden all the time, don't you? There he is. Edward Snowden, one more question about the president-elect, the elections. Did you follow the elections?
I did. I think everybody in the world did.
Yeah. So, is the outcome better or worse for your case?
For me, I try to focus on the issues that matter the most here. And while I obviously care about what happens to me, I am the least important part of any of this. This is not about me. This is about us. And when I see these changes in government, where we see these candidates who are extremely authoritarian, they believe that if we have the power to do something, we should do something. We stop thinking about wrong or right. We stop thinking about should or should not. And instead we focus strictly on can or cannot. These, I think, are civic dangers to everyone. And these are the things that we have to focus the most on resisting, not individual cases, but broad social cases. And this is the thing that I think we begin to forget when we focus too much on a single candidate. The current president of the United States, President Barack Obama, campaigned on a platform of ending mass surveillance in the United States. He said no more warrantless wiretapping. He said he would investigate and end criminal activities that had occurred under the prior administration, in the Bush era. We're talking about torture. We're talking about extrajudicial killings. And we all put a lot of hope in him because of this. Not just people in my country, not just myself, but people in Europe and elsewhere around the world. It was a moment where we believed that because the right person got into office, everything would change. But unfortunately, once he took that office, we saw that he didn't actually fulfill those campaign promises. Guantanamo Bay, the secret prison in Cuba, which he had promised to close on the first day of his presidency, is still open and likely will be on the last day of his presidency. He embraced the policies of mass surveillance, extended them, and entrenched them. And this isn't to criticize this president particularly. This is not to say Obama is what we should be worried about. This is to talk about a broader point, which is we should be cautious about putting too much faith or fear in the work of elected officials. At the end of the day, this is just a president. If we want to build or live or enjoy the fruits of a better world, if we want to make sure that the rights that we have encoded into our laws are actually reliable, that we live with them and pass them to our children, this will never be the work of politicians. This can only be the work of the people, of the population, because politicians do not simply do what they think is best. They do what they think people want to hear. They do what they think will gain them support. And ultimately, if we want to see a change, we must force it through ourselves. If we want to have a better world, we can't hope for an Obama, and we should not fear a Donald Trump. Rather, we should build it ourselves.
Other subject. Thank you. A question out of the many questions we got about U.S. companies. U.S. laws like the Patriot Act require U.S. businesses to cooperate with government surveillance. Can we trust U.S. corporations with sensitive information like our email, or should we prefer non-U.S. companies?
I'm not sure if this is a serious question.
It is.
But I'll answer it as if it were. We have seen real problems with that. There was quite recently, in the wake of June 2013, President Obama going throughout Europe and saying, these newspaper stories that you've heard about all the spying, they're not very well understood. It doesn't mean what you think. The NSA isn't simply rifling through your emails. Mass surveillance doesn't really exist. These are targeted programs. We're only looking for specific people. And yet, only the beginning of last month, October of 2016, we found that one of the largest email service providers in the United States had secretly gone beyond what the law required, and the law does require a lot of these companies, to scan on behalf of the U.S. intelligence community the emails of all of their customers as they come or go, for particular pieces of information that were provided by U.S. spy agencies. Now, the question that you should be asking yourself is not, should I trust U.S. companies, which it's clear, unfortunately, in many cases, they can't be trusted, but can you trust your own? Are countries in the Netherlands any better? Are companies in Germany better? And unfortunately, we see a march of these kind of laws sweeping across Europe right now and more broadly the world. The United Kingdom is in the midst of passing the most extreme surveillance measure in the history of any Western society right now, called the Investigatory Powers Bill, which legitimizes and entrenches mass surveillance in a way that would be unacceptable even in the United States, where we've grown quite comfortable with many of these programs. The Netherlands has similar policies. Norway is debating one right now. Germany claimed to pass a reform package quite recently that actually wasn't a reform package. Instead, it legitimized some of the unlawful programs that occurred before. And what we need to start thinking about is, rather than can we trust any company generally, can we start finding specific, particularized companies that can be trusted? Can we look to business models and business practices of particular institutions, corporations, that see you as their primary customer, as seeing you as the one to which they owe the greatest loyalty, rather than to some government, whether it's your own or some foreign government or any other place? And can they prove that this is a relationship that you should trust through their application of technology? I'll simplify this just by demonstrating what I mean in a simpler way. In the midst of that same Yahoo case, we saw there was another telecommunications provider in the United States. This is also October, around the same day. This is an app called Signal, used for sending text messages on your phone or making calls that are encrypted, that are protected, that are electronically clothed, they're armored, like we discussed earlier, to transit the hostile internet. And the FBI used these laws to go after this company. But rather than doing what Yahoo did and simply giving the government far more than what they asked for, they went to the American Civil Liberties Union, the largest civil rights organization in the United States, and they said, what can we do? And the ACLU said, well, you have to help the government as the law requires, but only what the law requires. And Signal said, well, can we fight this gag order? That meant we couldn't tell our customers what was going on. We couldn't tell the public how the government was trying to use our service for the purposes of gathering secret intelligence. And they won. And when they revealed what they actually turned over to the government, it was only this. These black bars are the entirety of the information that they turned over, which are only the phone numbers of the accounts that had been registered with the service, which the government already had. Because the government was saying, hey, pull all the records you have on this phone number. And they said, all right, here are all the records that we kept. And the only information they had was when the account was created and the last time it was connected. Because this company, Signal, this app provider, they weren't spying on their customers. That was not their business model. They weren't collecting records that they could then be forced to turn over. This is very similar to previous times in history when companies had collected a lot of information, but then there were changes, more militarized societies that came over, and then they had to hand over these vast databases of information that were used for the purposes of persecution. We should never enter that kind of world again. And the best way to defend against it is to make sure that you do not collect information as a business that you do not need.
How do you think the awareness of the public is growing or fading already since 2013, since your actions?
Yeah, I mean, it's natural for these things to sort of fade. People don't remember exactly what happened. Many people didn't see the original stories at all. When we go through the kind of things that were demonstrated in 2013, many of you have probably heard of the PRISM program. You've seen it in the film. You know the largest internet companies in the world voluntarily joined this program. You may have also heard about upstream communications, where rather than going to the internet companies themselves, they went to the phone companies. They went to sort of these fiber optic networks that tie the European continent to the American continent, and instead just listened to everything. But you might not have heard of other programs where the NSA was spying on the pornography viewing habits of individuals that they considered to have radical political beliefs. These were Islamists, to be fair, but these were individuals that the NSA's own top secret documents said they did not suspect of violence, and they did not suspect to be actually tied to terrorist activity. They just didn't like their politics. The United Kingdom was collecting images from people's webcams. If you happen to use Yahoo Messenger some years ago when that was a popular thing, the camera that was in your bedroom, they were collecting an image from every 5 minutes, and they were storing it permanently. In Australia, the same infrastructure that the United States government had built, the technology that we had developed and shared, they were using to identify the sources of journalists who had written reports that they considered critical. Programs that had been justified on the basis of national security, that they said were going to be used strictly for counterterrorism purposes, had instead been used to target U.S. lawyers, which is actually a violation of law. And not because they thought these lawyers had some special intelligence that would save lives, but rather because they were negotiating a trade deal with Indonesia over the price of shrimp and clove cigarettes. These things will fade, but there is one thing that we should remember. When we look at the investigation into the effectiveness of these programs, the U.S. government's own staff, right? These are not sort of liberal reformers. These are not people who want to see an open society. This board was comprised of individuals such as the former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Michael Morrell. And they found that this kind of mass surveillance that had been justified on the basis of countering terrorism had actually never been useful in that context. It had never stopped a single terrorist plot, and it had never made, and this is the government's words, a quote, a concrete difference in the outcome of any terrorism investigation. These programs were never about terrorism. They were about economic espionage, they were about diplomatic manipulation, they were about social influence, they're about power. And that's what espionage has always been about. Countering terrorism is not an intelligence activity in the traditional sense. That is a police activity. And when we hear people, when we hear spies, when we hear politicians saying, give up your rights to allow us to create these intelligence infrastructures of extraordinary powers because terrorists exist in the world, you should remember that there have always been terrorists in the past. We have always been able to counter them effectively. And we did this through the traditional means of police work and investigation that have always been effective in the past. Why are we proposing to throw away all of the rights that people fought and died to establish over centuries of human civilization for programs that even the US government says were never effective?
Okay. You say mass surveillance is not productive for attacking terrorist attacks, but intelligence services need some information, a lot of information, to protect the people, they say, and we believe. So, what kind of information and what kind of programs need intelligence services to protect us from bombings like in Boston, like in Paris, like in Brussels? If mass surveillance is not appropriate.
Yeah, this is an excellent question because when we look at the Boston Marathon bombings, for example, this was during the height of American mass surveillance. This was before anybody knew it existed, before it hit the newspapers. And they were collecting the phone calls of everyone. They were collecting the internet activities of, people indiscriminately, just in case they were useful. And it did not stop this attack. And it did not stop this attack even though we had been specifically warned by foreign intelligence services that these individuals were associated with terrorism. Much the same in Brussels. Now, we had known about mass surveillance in a broad sense here. But in the Brussels attacks, Belgium had been warned, by the Turks in this case, that some of these individuals were associated with terrorism. So it begs the question, why did mass surveillance fail to catch these individuals? It's not because they used encryption. It's not because they were particularly skillful. It's not because they were just so clever. It's because when you collect everything, the communications of everyone in the nation, you understand nothing. You get drowned in so much information that you can't find what's actually relevant. If you use traditional means of investigation, gathering indicators, tips from, for example, these foreign intelligence services, you take them to a court, you go to a judge, you say, look, we have some evidence this person has ties to terrorism. We would like a warrant for our police to sneak into their homes, to place a camera, to tap a phone, to follow them as they go through their activities in the day, as we always have for decades at this point. You can watch specifically the individuals who exhibit indications of actually threatening behavior, and then you can catch them in the act. And these are the cases where we have seen it happen. In recent Canadian attacks that have been thwarted, it was not due to mass surveillance, but it was because of the fact that they watched specifically the individuals who they had been tipped off did have these activities, often by members of their family or by their communities, and they watched them. And then when suddenly they collect weapons, they call a taxi cab, and they try to go to a train station, the police are already there, ready to make the arrest and ready to support the attack, and it actually works. The distinction that I want to make here in simple terms, because I know that's a little bit broad, is what people in civil society, what I protest most strongly is mass surveillance, indiscriminate surveillance where they're watching everyone, targeted surveillance that's backed by a court where police have shown, look, this individual is more likely than not to be a criminal. We're asking for a warrant to investigate their activities for a period of time in a very intrusive way, but in a very targeted way. We're only watching this individual. We know it is effective because it has been in the past. And we know that this is the least intrusive means of achieving these investigative goals without destroying the rights of everyone else in a free society.
So you say mass surveillance isn't necessary for counter-terror attacks?
That's correct, but let's presume it were. Let's presume it were effective. Would we want it anyway? The challenge here is if we create a government that is so powerful, a structure that is so omniscient and knows everything that everyone's doing at every time, it can enforce the law perfectly. No one can steal a loaf of bread, no one can speed, no one can commit a terrorist act, no one can murder. A lot of people would say that's fabulous, it's the end of crime, and it's true. But that may not be as unmitigated a good as it seems at first glance. Because when we think about social progress, when we think about the advance of human rights, when we think about the abolition of slavery, when we think about marriage equality, when we think about the prohibition of drugs or certain kinds of alcohol in the past, prohibition of certain types of religious worship, all of these movements were criminal activities in the beginning. Even if it's the enfranchisement of women, allowing them to vote. If government simply says the laws on the books can be enforced, and they will be enforced, and we will use the full extent of our powers to ensure that is the case, what they're doing is they're halting progress at this moment in time. They're saying we have gone far enough, and no one can transgress against the status quo, even for a good reason. No one can organize to change the law. If to do so, they have to love someone in a way that's not approved. They have to worship in a way that's not popular. They have to do any activity that has not been explicitly authorized in advance by the government. I do not see that as a bright future. In fact, I see it as a very dark one.
I really like to ask you what we can do about that. But first, this is quite a bad situation where we're in now. But I want to make it worse because I have a question about the way, let's see, where have I the question? Yeah, the technology develops enormously. Everybody can buy the software to spy on one another. So how can we stop Big Brother before we going paranoid?
Yeah, so this is a very complex technical question, and I'm very comfortable saying that as of today, we don't have an answer. We have ideas, we have directions for research, but this is not a solved problem. And for the young people in the audience, this is a problem that you could solve. What we're seeing today is the atomic moment of computer science. We're living through it. What nuclear physics had in the last century, we are seeing for this discipline, computer science, today in our lifetimes. Technologies that we expected to be a benefit for all of mankind are being subverted. They're being corrupted in subtle ways to work contrary to those purposes. And we have to find a way today to change that direction and make it serve humanity rather than master humanity. And the ideas that we're looking at here are for simple methods to do things that we've never really considered before. For example, encryption, as we've talked about before, protects what you said on a phone call as it crosses the internet. It protects what was written in a text message. It protects your picture so no one can see it if you share a photograph with someone. But it does not disguise the fact that you sent a photograph or made a phone call or made a purchase or visited a website or necessarily bought this book from a bookseller online. And these things on their own can be very dangerous. These types of activities are called metadata, right? And these communications, or these records about your activity, even encrypted communications, are private activity records, right? But they have no meaningful legal protections today. So even governments in countries that aren't so bad about mass surveillance, even in the Netherlands, for example, the metadata of your activities can often be collected even without the involvement of a court. And this means you can create perfect records of private lives without ever reading what was actually said in the message. The way to change this is we have to find ways to protect not only the content of the communication in that text message or phone call, but to disguise the fact that the communication ever happened at all. The fact that this phone called this phone should be invisible to the vast majority.
One day, is there a technical possibility there is, perhaps, or not?
We have seen methods of disguising this already. There's what's called the Tor protocol, which is a method of what's called a mixed routing network. It's not perfect, and in fact, it cannot protect against the full cooperation of all of these governments on Earth because they can just trade the different parts they see. But what it does is instead of sending your communications from here to here, this computer to this computer, it sort of bounces them around the world in a lot of jurisdictions. So you can't see the direct relationship. This is very crude. This is like, inventing the very first wheel, which is, kind of a rock that sort of rolls, but not in a very effective manner. But as we refine these capabilities, as we look for more models of achieving the same ends, it is perhaps possible. And the easiest way to illustrate this is the way that radio frequency broadcasts work. For example, if you think of the prior generation, or as you listen to music in your car, there's a tower somewhere that's sending communications, and anyone can hear them, but there's no record of who is actually listening, who actually received the signal. That's not to say this is an effective means for resolving our problems today in this context, but there are many things that we thought impossible problems in the past